When the gates opened, they did not cheer, they bowed. The war had ended, yet silence filled the camp. These were soldiers of Japan, men raised to die before surrender. But now, standing on foreign soil, they hesitated to return home. They had faced fire, hunger, and defeat, yet here, among their enemies, they found something they never expected: respect. Some called it weakness, others called it peace. Why did these men, warriors of the Emperor, feel safer in America than in their own homeland? And what did they discover behind the barbed wire that changed them forever? This is the story of the Japanese prisoners who found humanity where they least expected it. Before the surrender, Japan was not just at war with the world, it was at war with its own soul. From birth, every Japanese soldier was taught one thing: to die with honor, never to surrender. The ancient Bushido code was not just a belief, it was a way of life. It whispered in every heart: better to fall by your own sword than to live in shame. In those final months of the Pacific War, entire islands became graves. German soldiers had surrendered in thousands. But the Japanese, they fought to the very last man. In Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Saipan, the pattern was always the same. When defeat was certain, they chose death. Mothers threw themselves and their children from cliffs, believing capture was worse than the afterlife. So when the American forces finally began taking prisoners, alive, it was a shock to both sides. The men they captured were not defiant warriors anymore. They were starving, burned, and broken, too weak to even lift their rifles. And yet, their eyes still held one thing: shame. They expected torture, humiliation, or execution. For them, captivity was not mercy, it was dishonor. Some whispered prayers, waiting for the bullet that never came. But instead of death, something else happened. The Americans offered them water, medical help, a blanket, a bandage. One soldier later wrote, "When they cleaned my wounds, I cried, not from pain, but from confusion. For the first time, they saw the enemy as human. For the first time, they wondered if everything they had been taught was wrong." As days passed in the camps, silence replaced gunfire. The men began to feel emotions they had long buried: hunger, guilt, gratitude, and above all, curiosity. Who were these people who treated their enemies with such decency? And could it be possible that the world beyond Japan was not made of monsters, but of men? Their war had ended, but a new kind of battle had just begun, the one inside their hearts. When the war finally ended, the silence fell heavier than explosions that came before it. Ships crossed the Pacific, carrying thousands of Japanese prisoners, men who had once sworn never be taken alive. They expected punishment, pain, or worse. But when they reached the American shores, Texas, Hawaii, California, even the cold plains of the Midwest, what they saw left them speechless. The camps were not what they had imagined. No cages, no chains, no angry guards shouting in foreign tongues. Instead, there were rows of wooden barracks, clean paths, and men in uniform who spoke with firm but calm voices. It felt strange. Too calm, too organized. And for many, that calm was terrifying. The first meal came that night: warm bread, meat, vegetables, and coffee. But hundreds of prisoners refused to touch it. They believed it was a trick, a test before execution. Some whispered prayers. Others bowed their heads and waited for punishment. Yet the Americans did not force them. They simply left the food, watched quietly, and waited. Within hours, the hunger became stronger than fear. One soldier took a bite. Another followed. And when nothing happened, a quiet wave of relief swept through the room. Still, they could not understand. Why were they being treated this way? Why did their enemies show them dignity that their own leaders had denied them? The American guards, too, were puzzled. They had fought these same men, fierce, relentless, unyielding. Now they watched them bow before every meal, whispering thanks to invisible ancestors, even behind barbed wire. Their discipline, their silence, their humility, it left a mark on everyone who saw it. Among those prisoners was a young man named Hiroshi Tanaka, 23 years old, from Osaka. He had joined the Imperial Army believing in the code of the warrior, that surrender was worse than death. Now, every breath he took felt like betrayal. He could not look his fellow soldiers in the eye. In his heart, shame weighed heavier than his chains. On a cold morning, as frost covered the campground, Hiroshi stood shivering outside the barracks. His thin uniform offered no warmth. An American guard, perhaps no older than him, noticed, without a word. He handed Hiroshi a small tin cup of hot tea. For a moment, Hiroshi froze, unsure if he should accept it. But when he took that first sip, his hands trembled. It was the first warmth he had felt since the war began. That night, as he lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling, Hiroshi wondered, could an enemy show more mercy than a friend? He did not know it yet, but this small act of kindness would begin to change everything he believed about honor, loyalty, and humanity itself. Days slowly turned into weeks, and weeks into months. For the first time in years, the prisoners woke to the sound of birds instead of bombs. The barbed wire still surrounded them, yet beyond it, life moved in rhythm. Every morning, groups of Japanese soldiers were led out of the camp gates. Some worked on nearby farms. Others repaired country roads or helped in small factories. Their hands, once used to hold rifles, now lifted tools, planted seeds, and built fences. They worked quietly, efficiently, never arguing, never slacking. Their discipline impressed everyone who saw them. Local American farmers began to notice. They had heard stories of Japan, fierce warriors, unbreakable loyalty. But here, these men were gentle, polite, and astonishingly hard-working. When they finished their shifts, they bowed to the farmers before leaving, a gesture that always left the Americans speechless. Respect, even in captivity, it was something new. As days passed, the atmosphere in the camp began to shift. The American commanders saw the order, the discipline, and sincerity of these men. So they made a quiet decision. They would allow small freedoms, simple ones, but enough to remind the prisoners that they were still human. Soon, corners of the camp began to bloom. Some prisoners started tending tiny gardens, planting flowers beside the fences. Others wrote haikus in their notebooks, short poems about wind, memory, and peace. In the evenings, a few played makeshift flutes or hummed the songs of their homeland. One of those men was Hiroshi Tanaka. He had found an old pencil and a torn notebook. Each night, by the light of a dim bulb, he wrote quietly. In one entry, he wrote, "They call us enemy, yet treat us as guests. I do not understand it, but I am grateful." His words were simple, but filled with something that had been lost long ago: peace. The camp began to sound different too. Laughter returned, soft and cautious at first, then louder. Some men began learning English words from the guards: water, friend, home. Others painted pictures of Mount Fuji from memory, its peak rising above clouds they would never see again. At night, the faint sound of American jazz floated from the guardhouse radio. And though they did not understand the words, the rhythm made them smile. The transformation was subtle, almost invisible, but real. The fear that once filled every corner had started to fade. In its place grew something fragile, something deeply human. Narrator's voice softens. Somewhere between duty and decency, these men began to heal. They were still prisoners, but inside, something had been set free. As the sun set beyond the fences, Hiroshi looked at the sky, the same sky that stretched over Japan. For the first time in years, he whispered a small prayer, not for victory, not for home, but for peace, honor. It was the first word every Japanese soldier learned, and the last they were ever meant to forget. From the moment they entered training, they were taught that surrender was worse than death. To be captured was to lose one's soul, to live on as a disgrace to one's family, one's emperor, one's very existence. Even behind the quiet fences of America, that belief lingered like a shadow. When night fell, the men whispered in their barracks, their voices trembling with guilt and confusion. Are we still soldiers of Japan? One man asked. If we accept kindness from our enemies? No one answered, because deep inside, they all felt the same torment. They had survived, but at the cost of their honor. Hiroshi Tanaka listened to those whispers every night. He understood their pain. But each morning, when the sun rose over the camp and the guards opened the gates, he felt something else. A strange calm. Perhaps it was the warmth of the sun. Perhaps it was the sound of laughter in the distance. Or perhaps it was a realization that, even as a prisoner, he was alive and treated as a man. One morning, Hiroshi was assigned to work with a local farmer. The man was older, quiet, and always wore the same worn-out hat. They spoke little. Words meant little between them, but through gestures and patience, they learned to understand one another. Side by side, they mended fences, carried wood, and tended to animals. The work was honest, simple, and strangely peaceful. One afternoon, while resting beneath a tree, the farmer looked toward the horizon and said slowly, words Hiroshi barely understood. War makes monsters, but peace makes men again. The meaning took a while to settle in, but when it did, it stayed with Hiroshi like a flame that refused to die out. That night, he wrote in his notebook, perhaps honor is not only in dying for one's land, but in learning how to live without hatred. The next morning, he noticed something different among the men. The silence that once felt like shame now carried reflection. Some of them began to help the American workers without being told. Others started fixing tools, sweeping barns, or planting vegetables for the local families. They no longer worked as prisoners. They worked as men trying to reclaim their humanity. Day by day, the invisible walls between captor and captive began to fall. They shared bread, water, and sometimes laughter. A few Americans brought photographs of their families, showing wives and children back home. In return, the Japanese soldiers shared stories of their villages, their mothers, and their sea. The war had turned them into enemies. But now, through shared sweat and silence, they had begun to see each other not as symbols, but as souls. And somewhere in the middle of that realization, Hiroshi began to change. He began to wonder if loyalty to cruelty was truly loyalty at all. Perhaps the greatest honor was not in dying faithfully, but in living kindly. It was the morning of August 15th, 1945. The air inside the camp was heavy, hotter than usual, yet eerily still. Men were working quietly, some repairing fences, others cleaning tools, when the guards suddenly called everyone to gather. No one knew why. A radio had been placed on a wooden table in the center of the yard. An American officer stood nearby, turning the dial carefully until the static began to fade. Then a voice came through, distant, trembling, formal. It spoke in Japanese. For a moment, the prisoners froze. They recognized that tone. It was the voice of the emperor. For the first time in their lives, they heard him speak. Every man stopped breathing. They stood still, then slowly knelt to the ground. The barbed wire, the guards, the foreign soil, all disappeared from their minds. In that moment, they were back in Japan, listening to the divine voice they had worshipped since childhood. But the words were not what they expected. He spoke of enduring the unendurable. He spoke of surrender. The empire had fallen. Silence spread like a wave. Some men trembled. Others buried their faces in their hands. A few began to weep openly. For years, they had been taught that the emperor was not merely a man. He was a god. And now, that god was telling them that the war was over. Hiroshi felt his heart pounding. He whispered to himself, "The voice of our god sounds like a man." It was the most human sound he had ever heard, and it shattered something inside him, not out of anger, but out of revelation. The war had ended not with gunfire or glory, but with a voice, calm, sorrowful, accepting defeat. For years, they had been ready to die for the empire. Now, their emperor had told them to live. Some men cried with relief, feeling the weight of years of fear lifted from their shoulders. Others bowed until their foreheads touched the ground, unable to face the shame that surrender brought. No one spoke. Even the guards stayed silent. The world had changed, and none of them knew what to do next. When the broadcast ended, the radio clicked off. A bird flew across the empty sky above the camp, and in the stillness that followed, a quiet truth began to grow inside every man there. When the gates finally opened, many would not know where to go. The journey home began quietly. Weeks after the Emperor's voice echoed across the camps, trucks lined up under the gray morning sky. One by one, the Japanese prisoners climbed aboard. There were no cheers, no songs, no goodbyes, only silence and the sound of boots on wooden planks. Hiroshi sat near the window of a transport ship, his thin hands folded tightly in his lap. The sea stretched endlessly before him, cold, gray, and unfamiliar. He had crossed the same ocean as a soldier filled with pride. Now, he was returning as a man filled with questions. For days, the ship moved through fog and quiet waves. Men whispered softly, some clutching photographs, others nothing at all. When the coastline of Japan finally appeared, many pressed their faces to glass, but no one smiled. From a distance, it looked like home. Up close, it looked like loss. They disembarked onto a harbor filled with rubble and twisted metal. The air smelled of ash and salt. Buildings that once reached proudly toward the sky were now piles of stone. Children wandered barefoot through streets where houses had stood. Old men sat by the water, staring at nothing. Hiroshi's heart grew heavy with every step. He walked through Osaka, his city, his birthplace, now unrecognizable. The roads were cracked, the air thick with dust. He passed what had once been his family's neighborhood. Only fragments remained, a half-burned fence, a broken teacup, the faint outline of a door. Among the ruins, he found a single piece of charred wood. On it, faint but visible, was a family name, Tanaka. He fell to his knees and touched the letters with trembling fingers. The wood was still blackened from the fire. His breath caught in his throat. He had survived the war, but not the loss. Around him, the few survivors looked at the returning soldiers not as heroes, but as reminders of defeat. Whispers followed them through the streets. They surrendered. In the eyes of many, surrender was worse than death. To live was to bear shame. Some avoided eye contact. Others spat near their feet. A child pointed and asked his mother, "Why did they not die like the brave ones?" The mother turned away without answering. Hiroshi walked on, each step heavier than the last. He realized that the silence of home was colder than the fences of the camp. In America, he had been a prisoner, yet treated as a man. Here, in his homeland, he was free, yet treated as a ghost. As the sun began to set, he sat by the riverbank, watching the water reflect the ruins. He closed his eyes and remembered the golden fields of Texas, the laughter of farmers, the taste of warm bread, the distant sound of jazz carried by the wind. He remembered the faces that had shown him kindness without reason. And for the first time, he whispered aloud, "In the land of my enemies, I was a man. Here I am a shadow." The river carried his words away, soft and endless. He picked up a stone and held it tightly, feeling the earth of his homeland, scarred, yet still alive. Somewhere within that broken land, he hoped there was still a place for men like him. Men who had seen both war and mercy, and could no longer tell which had changed them more. As night fell, distant lights flickered across the shattered skyline. Japan was rebuilding slowly, painfully, and among the ruins, Hiroshi began to rebuild himself one breath, one step, one memory at a time. Years passed. The war that had once swallowed the world became a memory whispered through the generations. Hiroshi Tanaka, now an older man with silver in his hair and calm in his eyes, spent his days working on bridges. Real bridges made of steel and stone, but also unseen ones made of understanding. He no longer wore the uniform of a soldier. His hands, once trained for battle, now shaped the foundations of peace. Each beam he lifted, each bolt he tightened, felt like a silent apology to the past and a promise to the future. At night, He would sit by a small desk near the window of his rebuilt home. There, under the glow of a paper lantern, he wrote letters addressed not to generals or governments, but to the American farmers he had once worked beside during his captivity. His handwriting was slow, deliberate, filled with emotion. In one letter, he wrote, "You taught me that peace is built, not won. You showed me that kindness does not belong to nations, it belongs to hearts." He wrote about the small moments that had stayed with him. The cup of tea on a cold morning, the laughter shared while repairing a fence, the sound of jazz playing from a distant radio. He never knew if those letters were received. Some were lost in the mail, others forgotten in attics. But decades later, a historian found a bundle of them in a family chest in Kansas, tied with an old string, still smelling faintly of ink and paper. Inside, each letter spoke of a friendship born from war's ashes, proof that compassion could outlive conflict. The narration softens. We see rusted barbed wire now overgrown with flowers, twisting gently in the wind. Children run and play where the camp once stood, their laughter echoing to the fields once marked by fear. Time had erased the fences, but not the lessons. An old diary lies open on a wooden table, its pages yellowed by the years. The final entry reads, "I lost my country, but found my humanity." As the camera pans toward the horizon, the morning sun breaks through the mist, light spilling across quiet farmland. A voice, steady and reflective, closes the story. War ended with surrender, but peace began in the hearts of men who learned to forgive. A brief pause, then the tone shifts slightly, inviting the listener to keep walking through history. Next, we uncover another forgotten chapter of the war, where even in captivity, the human spirit refused to die. Subscribe and walk with us through history's quiet echoes.